They ignored him, dismissed him, and assumed he was just another desperate man grasping at straws, until he revealed the deception right before the judge's eyes. The courtroom wasn't just skeptical of him. It had already decided against him before he even opened his mouth. Ethan Hayes stepped forward, his suit a little worn at the edges, his tie slightly off-center, but his resolve unshaken. He wasn't a lawyer, never claimed to be. He was just a grandson who refused to let his family's home be snatched away by a corporation that saw lives as numbers and profits as law. Judge Malcolm Thornton adjusted his glasses, glancing down at Ethan over the rim. His lips curled in something that wasn't quite amusement, but close. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. "Mr. Hayes, are you representing yourself?" The question carried a trace of condescension. Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "Yes, Your Honor." A quiet chuckle came from the opposing table. Nicholas Dane, the corporate attorney, casually adjusted his expensive watch. A courtroom shark with a history of making legal challenges disappear, Dane wasn't here to argue. He was here to win. And Ethan? He wasn't even worth taking seriously. "This won't take long," Dane muttered to his assistant, who smirked in response. Ethan heard it. He was supposed to. That was the game. They wanted him rattled. They wanted him to question himself. But they didn't know him. Judge Thornton sighed, flipping through the file before him. "This is a dispute over property rights, correct? A foreclosure appeal?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir. My grandmother's house." Thornton barely looked at him. "And you think you can take on a seasoned attorney like Mr. Dane?" Ethan's voice was steady. "I don't think, Your Honor." "I know." A few soft chuckles echoed from the opposing side of the room. But there was something else now, too. A shift, a sense that someone who should have backed down was choosing to stand his ground. Judge Thornton shook his head. "Very well. Let's begin." But Ethan hadn't come here just to argue. He came here to win. The real battle was with the man sitting across from him. The one who thought Ethan had already lost before the fight had even begun. Dane straightened his tie, his smirk unwavering. The courtroom was his stage, the legal system his weapon. He had crushed dozens like Ethan Hayes before, ordinary people trying to fight battles they didn't have the knowledge or resources to win. This wasn't a trial. It was routine. The judge exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Dane, you may begin with your opening statement." Dane rose with practiced ease, buttoning his jacket as he walked toward the jury. His voice was smooth, polished. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is straightforward." He gestured toward Ethan without acknowledging him directly. "We have a man who refuses to accept the facts. The property in question was legally repossessed by my client under foreclosure laws. The rules are clear. The numbers don't lie. This is not about emotions. This is about contractual obligations and legal deadlines." He paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle. "My client followed the law. Mr. Hayes did not." A confident nod. A slow, measured step back. Then he sat down, hands folded neatly, as if the matter had already been decided. Ethan remained motionless, his expression unreadable. He had anticipated every word of Dane's speech. But as he stood, he caught the way Judge Thornton leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. A man who wasn't expecting much. Ethan cleared his throat. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court." His voice was calm, sure. "Mr. Dane is right about one thing. The law is clear. But the real question is, does his client actually follow it?" Dane's smirk faltered for the briefest moment. Ethan continued. "I've spent months digging into the practices of banks and corporate lenders. I've read every case, every statute, every trick they use to push people out of their homes. And I found something." Judge Thornton raised an eyebrow. "Something?" Ethan nodded. "Yes. And it changes everything." A quiet scoff came from Dane. "Oh, this should be good." Ethan ignored him. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to file an official request for full discovery, because I have reason to believe the plaintiff has engaged in fraudulent activity." The temperature in the room seemed to shift. Judge Thornton's expression grew more serious. "Fraud?" His tone was skeptical, but beneath it was something else, curiosity. Ethan's gaze locked on Dane. "Yes, Your Honor." I believe my grandmother's foreclosure was based on falsified documents, and I can prove it, if I'm allowed access to the full records." Dane let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. A desperate attempt to delay the inevitable." The foreclosure followed standard procedures. Ethan tilted his head. "Standard, Mr. Dane? Then tell me, how standard is it for a bank to seize a home using mortgage documents with two completely different signatures for the same person?" The courtroom murmured. Dane's jaw tensed. "What are you implying?" Ethan pulled 2 sheets from his folder, handing them to the bailiff, who delivered them to the judge. "These are 2 copies of the mortgage agreement. One from the original contract, one from a later modification. Compare the signatures." Thornton leaned in, scrutinizing the documents. His brow furrowed. Ethan pressed on. "The second signature? That's not my grandmother's. And it was signed the day after she suffered a stroke." A wave of reaction rippled through the room. Even the jury leaned forward. Judge Thornton turned to Dane. "Mr. Dane, does your client have the original signed paperwork?" Dane hesitated. Ethan saw it. So did the judge. We will need time to retrieve it, Your Honor." Ethan smiled. "That's fine. I'll wait." The silence wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. This was only the beginning. Dane, for the first time, wasn't so sure of himself. The cracks in his confidence were showing. And Ethan wasn't about to stop. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness," Ethan announced. Judge Thornton looked intrigued. "A witness?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, the person who notarized the mortgage modification." A hushed gasp rippled through the room. The doors at the back creaked open. A woman stepped in, Clara Benson, a notary public. She looked uneasy but resolute as she approached the stand. Judge Thornton nodded. "State your full name and occupation." "Clara Benson. I'm a licensed notary." Ethan took a step closer. "Ms. Benson, do you remember notarizing my grandmother's mortgage modifications?" Clara swallowed hard. "Yes." Ethan's voice was steady. "And were you present when she signed it?" A pause. A flicker of hesitation. Then, finally, the truth. "No." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Thornton's expression hardened. "Ms. Benson, are you saying the document was notarized without you witnessing the signatures?" She nodded. "I was given the paperwork by a bank representative. I was told it was already signed, and I just needed to stamp it." Dane shot up. "Objection. This is hearsay." Judge Thornton cut him off. "Overruled." Ethan turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, between the forged signature, the improper transfers, and now this testimony, the foreclosure is fraudulent. I move to have it nullified." A long pause. Then, "The court rules in favor of the defendant. The foreclosure is void. The property is to be returned immediately." Ethan exhaled. Months of fighting had led to this. He turned, locking eyes with Dane. The man who had dismissed him was now speechless. But this wasn't about beating Dane. It was about proving something greater. Power doesn't belong only to those with money. It belongs to those who refuse to give up. And today, the underestimated had won. Ethan Hayes walked out of the courtroom, the weight of months of relentless struggle finally lifting from his shoulders. The battle had been long, exhausting, and filled with moments of doubt. But in the end, justice had prevailed. His grandmother's home would not be taken. Not by corporate greed, not by forged documents, and certainly not by men who thought power belonged only to those with expensive suits and polished rhetoric. As he stepped onto the courthouse steps, a breeze hit him, cool and refreshing. It felt different now, lighter, the kind of air that comes after a storm has passed. Behind him, Nicholas Dane remained in the courtroom, still reeling. The man who once scoffed at Ethan, who treated him like an amateur, had just been exposed, his confidence shattered, his case obliterated. But Ethan wasn't thinking about Dane anymore. This fight had never been about revenge. It had been about something far greater, proving that the underestimated, the overlooked, the ones they thought didn't stand a chance, could still win. And not just win, change the game. Because power doesn't always belong to those who have the most resources. Sometimes it belongs to the ones who refuse to quit. And today, that was Ethan.